So quality of hire is one of the most hotly debated topics in talent acquisition and I think HR in general. And the questions always stem back to who should own the quality of hire metric, and then actually how should we measure it? And there's been some really interesting analysis recently and some reports on a few different ways to actually think about this, such that the recruiting team have control over things that they can influence, and the broader system is actually able to improve over time. I really like the systems thinking approach to this. And so we're actually going to get into the weeds today on how you can measure quality of hire, how to actually improve the system so that you improve quality of hire, and really how to actually have a real-time quality of hire score, which is something that has always been difficult to achieve. So let's get into it. So what I've done here is, this is actually part one. We're going to go through a two-part process where I'm going to go through initially how you can actually implement this new quality of hire approach. And then the second part, we're actually going to go into actually how do we get into the weeds of analyzing what's happening and then actually make improvements moving forward. So there's two real ways to measure quality of hire. The way that I've always advocated for is actually look at who we hired and look at their on-the-job performance. Tie that on-the-job performance back to the hiring process and actually use that to score quality of hire. And so you have this kind of like 6-month look back view on, did we actually hire the right person? One way that's being promoted right now is to actually use the interview debrief score and actually use an average of the competency scores that were given in the interviewer scorecard to actually figure out the quality of hire, assuming that those scorecards are correct. This is a really interesting approach because what it does is it actually gives you a real-time view of how are the candidates scoring when they're going through the process, and for the candidates that we made an offer to, how good were they based on a calibrated interview scorecard. Obviously, the big challenge there is it relies on that interview scorecard and the interview process being objective, unbiased, and consistent. And so there's definite pros and cons to each one. We scored across the different dimensions and we came out with an average of 3.8. And so that is our quality of hire. We made this hire and there are 3.8 out of 5. When we actually rescore them after 6 months, what we might actually find is that there was a delta between what we assumed that they were in the interview and how they actually performed on the job. So the actual quality of hire there was 3.4. Now, the argument being made is that the quality of hire that we should goal recruiters against is this one on the left-hand side. And then the way that we actually improve the recruiting outcome is to look where the rescore differs from the interview debrief score and actually try and figure out why we're seeing those deltas. And so the idea is we have this feedback loop, but the feedback loop doesn't change the score that we make. It actually scores a different part of the system, which is the actual recruiting process itself. So we can see that the side-by-sides, and here's a chart just showing where the score moved in this example. And so we can see, in communication and presence, we thought they were a 5. In coachability, actually, we thought they were a 3. They actually come out as a 4. And so the evidence that we got from the interview process was not consistent with what we saw in the first 6 months of this person's on-the-job performance. And what we really want to know is kind of why that happened. And that's what we're going to get to in part 2 of this series. If you want to actually implement this, you can get this starter kit. It's available on the Meander Talent Academy in the resources section. We have some free content up there as well. We also have all of our paid courses. We actually do a subscription-based model now where if you do want to stay up to date and continue training with data and with AI and the ability to communicate the output of those two systems back to senior leadership teams, please sign up. If you just want the starter kit, go ahead and download and just get started. It's going to be this Excel file that I'm showing you here. So the idea here is that we're going to rescore each hire at 6 months using the same rubric we used in the interview process. And then we can do a one-to-one match and see for each of these calibration scores, whether they actually stand based on the hiring manager's assessment. And then one final question, which is going to be based on what you now know about this person, would you rehire them? And that's going to be really insightful for us. The other thing we're actually going to do is implement a new hire check-in process as well, where we actually get information back from the new hire to try and understand, based on your experience through the interview process, how happy are you with what you thought the job was going to be about and what the job actually was. And all this information is going to give us this rich data source that we can use to make improvements to the interview process overall. So let's go into the manager check-in first. And really it's just 5 questions. We want to keep this as simple as possible. We don't want to be spending 30 minutes on each survey. It should take less than 5 minutes, and it should be really important. Actually, if you can make it mandatory, this is actually going to improve the overall business performance, because if you improve quality of hire, you improve the average performance of each individual in the organization, which means you improve the overall output of the organization. So 5 questions, rescore based on the 5 dimensions that we use in the interview process. Very important to make sure that these are the same that we use in the interview scorecard. Otherwise, you can't do a one-to-one match. Know what you know now. Would you make this hire again? How much would you regret losing this person? This is something that I've heard used a lot in McKinsey, Bain, BCG style environments, where you have a very, very clear up or out culture. And if you're not going to fight to retain someone or not regret losing someone, they're probably not necessarily a good fit for the team. And then ramp versus expectation, the biggest gap, more kind of like free text of like, actually, how do we improve the onboarding process, and where did we potentially go wrong in the interview process? Same thing with hire check-in, 5 questions, less than 5 minutes. How close was the role to the one that was described in the interview process? How closely did the actual in-person culture measure against what you saw in the interview process? Were you supported? What surprised you most? And would you recommend a friend to apply here? So similar to our candidate NPS approach, but we're actually doing new hire check-ins. A lot of this is actually in place, but I think one of the things that may be missing is the recruiting team actually getting this information back and actually using it to improve the overall process, which is where I argue we should really take ownership more on making sure that the system that we're using to bring new people into the organization is actually the most effective it can be, and we really elevate the overall standard of talent. And then finally, what we're going to do is do this rescore comparison. So every time we get this feedback, we can go back to look at the candidate score from the interview process, what it was at 6 months, and the delta, actually dig into why did it move. This is going to be really helpful as we start to analyze many different hires over many different teams, actually get down into figuring out which are the best interviewers, which are the best functions, where do we need to lean in to improve this process, and actually how can we nudge up quality of hire over time. But the session here that we just wanted to cover was actually what is quality of hire, what is an alternative way to measure it, and then how might you actually go about implementing the steps in order to do that effectively. And so once you've got that in place and you've started to gather this information, next, we're actually going to go into analyzing what that information looks like and how we can actually make changes. So I look forward to seeing you in the next video if you want to follow along. If you do want to make sure you're aware when that video is released, please subscribe. Please jot any comments or suggestions below. I read everyone, try and respond to everyone, and I'm very excited to continue with this series.